Hi, today I have my December wrap up and I have my notes so you will see me looking down. But before I start my wrap up, I want to tell you briefly about my 2018, what I read in 2018, which I already shared with you, by the way, in my December or my 2018 wrap up and my 2019 goals. But I found with Goodreads I could make this graphic with the aid of my iPad, so I'm going to show that now, and it will show you what I did last year. Okay, now as far as my wrap up is concerned, and as much as I wish I could remember these books, I don't, so I have to look down at my notes. The first book is The Exes of Revenge, and that is by Joe Jakeman. I got this from Edelweiss, I believe. I was only able to give this book 3 stars. And I'm not really happy with the book because I found the scenarios, some of them, to be rather fantastical. I felt as if in real life they couldn't really happen in the way that it was relayed. It was just a little bit much, but I did give it 3 stars. The next book I read was HerDarkest Nightmare by Brenda Novak, and this is book number 2 in the Evelyn Talbot series. It was a really good book. I gave it 4 stars. I read the first 2 books in the series. The first book was a novella, and then I read book 1, and as I'll mention later in this video, I read the second book. The next book I read was Wyoming Christmas Quadruplets, and this was by Jill Kemmerer. It is the Wyoming Cowboys number 3, and I gave this one 4 stars. The next book was a reread, and it is The Switch by Sandra Brown. Now, I read this book, this is my 3rd read. I read it, I believe, in 2000, and again maybe in 2007. So when I read it this time, I have to say that I had some pleasant surprises yet again. Excuse me for moving. Then I read Christmas on Mistletoe Lane, and I thought I had the book. Yes, I do. It's Christmas on Mistletoe Lane, and this is by Annie Raines. And this was a great little read. I really enjoyed it. Let's see, I gave this 5 stars. And also, this is the first book in the Sweetwater Springs series, so I do look forward to following that series. Then I read a bonus story, and I believe I read 5 bonus stories in December that I am including in my wrap-up. And this is A Midnight Clear, and this is by Hope Ramsey. It is the Last Chance number 9.5, and it's new to me, so I have not had a chance to read any of the other books in the series. Then I read Dark Hyde Rising by Anne Perry. This is the William Monk number 24. Now, I love Anne Perry. I've been reading her for years, but I haven't read this series. And when my schedule lightens up or my TBR lightens up, I will go back and read this series in order. Then I read Guess Who by Chris McGeorge. I only gave this 3 stars. It was kind of like let's see, and then there were None by Agatha Christie. It was kind of on that basis, but I didn't think it was very well done, especially the ending. The next book I read was Star Spangled Murder by Leslie Meyer. This is the 11th book in the Lucy Stone series, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I read the first 10, and there's 24 in all, and every month or so I'm trying to squeeze one in. My next book is, I have to get it, My One and Only Duke by Grace Burrows. It was a great read. It's the first book in the Rogues to Riches series, and I was able to give it 5 stars actually. Then I read Once Upon a Christmas Eve. It's another bonus story. This is by Elizabeth Hoyt. It was very enjoyable. It is the Maiden Lane number 12.6, and unfortunately I was not able to read any of the previous books. The next book I read was The Highland Duke, and The Highland Duke is by Amy Jarecki. It is the first book in the Lord of the Highlands series, and the reason I read The Highland Duke and the next 3 I'm about to tell you about is I got an email from an author. Her name is Megan Frampton, and she asked me if I would read the 5th book in this series, and so I was very happy to say that I would. So I went to my library and I got the first 4 titles. As I mentioned, I got The Highland Duke, then I read The Highland Commander, and The Highland Guardian. Now I'm going to pause for a moment because I gave each of those 4 stars. But then the 4th book was The Highland Chieftain, and I believe I gave that one 5 stars. Then I read Christmas Wishes and Mistletoe Kisses, and I'll show you that arc. And this is by Jenny Hale, as you can see. That was a great little read. I gave it 5 stars. The next book I read by Paula Quinn was The Highland Heirs number 1. Now, I read this book here because I got a book from the publisher, and that is this book, Highlander Ever After. It doesn't come out, I believe, until April or May, but I wanted to start reading the books in that series. Let's see, that brings me to The Trouble with Christmas. Let's find that arc. Here that is. It's by Debbie Mason. And I'm sorry, I cut the title off. That's The Trouble with Christmas. It's the Christmas Colorado series. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's the first in the series, and Christmas Colorado is the location or the setting. Then I read the 3rd book in the Evelyn Talbot series, and that is Hello Again by Brenda Novak. Another excellent read, very dark but a very good read, and I gave it 5 stars. The next book I read is The Lady is Daring, and this is by Megan Frampton, and I just mentioned her because she emailed me. And this is The Duke's Daughter number 3. I gave this book 4 stars, and I went ahead and downloaded the first 2 from my library, so I'm hoping to squeeze those in January. The next book I read, and I'm going to grab that arc, is Not the Duke's Darling. Let me hold it up better. There you go. Not the Duke's Darling by Elizabeth Hoyt. This was a Great Court number 1 series. Unfortunately, I was only able to give it 3.5 stars. The next book I read is The Paragon Hotel, and this is by Lindsay Fay. I gave this book 5 stars. This is a historical thriller, and let me tell you, and I'm going to expound upon this more in a future video, but this book touched on a lot of elements. Racism was key because it took place in the early 1900s and involved blacks and whites, so there was the Ku Klux Klan was involved. There was mental illness, there was physical illness, there was other issues. It was a very, very difficult read. Honestly, I'm sorry for looking away from the camera. because I'm thinking about the book, but it hit on a lot of issues and it kind of triggered me, but I really think it settled really well in the end, so I was glad to give it 5 stars. The next book I read was The Night Stalker by Robert Brinsda. Now, The Night Stalker is the Detective Erica Foster book number 2. I read The Girl on the Ice, which is number 6, which came out last year, and I think I read it back in July. So the publisher released the second book in the series, so I'm not quite sure why they didn't re-release the first book. But what I'm going to do is go back and read the entire series, grab the first book, and then read the 3rd, 4th, and 5th book, so that if there is indeed a 7th book, then I will have been caught up. The next book was Mistletoe Cottage, and this was by, this was by Debbie Mason. This is the Harmony Harbor book number 1, and I got this from Audible, I believe. The next book I read was Christmas with an Angel, which is Harmony Harbor number 1.5, and this was a bonus story in The Trouble with Christmas that I mentioned earlier. The next book I read was Immortal and Death by J.D. Robb. This was the 3rd book in the Detective Eve Dallas series, or actually, I'm sorry, this was the 3rd book in the In Death series, and there are 49 books in all. I had the first book in the series, Naked in Death, for years and years on Audible. I just never got to it. I never realized what I was missing. I've got several friends that are reading the series, one that is binging this series, and one that has read several titles in it. So I'm hoping to squeeze in at least 2 or 3 of these a month for now. But I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 5 stars. The next 2 books were bonus stories. One was Respect for Christmas by Grace Burrows. I gave this 4.5 stars, and this bonus story was in the Last Night with the Earl. And Last Night with the Earl was by Kelly Bowen. So Respect for Christmas was the bonus story in that. And then Patience for Christmas was a bonus story and Not the Duke's Darling by Elizabeth Hoyt, and I gave that one 4 stars. By the way, Respect for Christmas was only 97 pages, but Patience for Christmas was 160 pages. But as I said, I'm including them in my wrap-up. Then I read The Scots Bride, and this was Highland Heirs number 2 by Paula Quinn. As I mentioned, I want to read the Highland Heirs series because I am preparing to read Highlander Ever After. Then I read A Duke in the Night by Kelly Bowen, and this is The Devils of Dover number 1. And I read this because I got this arc, Last Night with the Earl by Kelly Bowen, which I haven't read yet, but because Last Night with the Earl is the 2nd book in the series, I wanted to read A Duke in the Night first. The next book I read was The Liar's Room by Simon Lelich. This was a pretty good book. I gave it 4 stars. It was very hard to read, but it was a pretty good book. I wavered between 3.5 and 4 stars because the ending was a bit flat, but it still was a pretty good book. It did keep my attention. The last book I read was a novella, and this was A Christmas Revelation by Anne Perry. I got this from NetGalley. It was pretty enjoyable, and I gave it 4 stars. That is it for December. I appreciate your time and your patience, and I look forward to giving you my next wrap-up. But before that, look forward to several videos which will incorporate some genres that I read in December, and I will discuss all of these books in greater detail then. All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.